Housewife's Confession: My Battle with Loneliness at Home. In the quiet suburbs of Denver, Colorado, Rebecca Martinez finds herself trapped in a carefully curated life that looks perfect from the outside but feels suffocatingly empty within. At 34, she's been a stay-at-home mother for 8 years, raising her 2 children while her husband David climbs the corporate ladder. What began as a conscious choice to prioritize family has gradually transformed into an isolating existence, where her days blur into a monotonous cycle of household chores, school runs, and silent evenings. As autumn settles over her neighborhood, Rebecca faces a profound identity crisis that forces her to confront uncomfortable truths about marriage, motherhood, and personal fulfillment. Through unexpected friendships, difficult conversations, and moments of painful self-discovery, she must navigate the complex terrain between duty and desire, ultimately learning that acknowledging loneliness isn't a betrayal of her family, it's the first step toward becoming whole again. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if my story touched your heart today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next confession. Give this video a like if it resonated with you, and share it with another woman who needs to know she's not alone. Together, our voices are stronger. Chapter 1: The Weight of Silence. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of the Martinez household, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that Rebecca had mopped just yesterday. She stood at the kitchen sink, mechanically loading the dishwasher, while the sounds of her family's morning routine played out behind her like a familiar symphony she no longer really heard. "Mom, where's my soccer jersey?" called out 12-year-old Emma from upstairs, her voice carrying that particular tone of preteen exasperation that had become increasingly common lately. "In your closet, honey." "Second drawer," Rebecca replied without turning around, her voice steady despite the weariness that seemed to live in her bones these days. She'd washed and folded that jersey just 2 days ago, placed it exactly where Emma could find it, but somehow these small acts of care had become invisible to everyone except herself. 9-year-old Marcus shuffled into the kitchen, his dark hair still messy from sleep, clutching his tablet. "Can I have pancakes?" he asked, already absorbed in whatever game was lighting up his screen. "We have cereal today, sweetheart. Maybe pancakes this weekend," Rebecca said, though she wasn't sure why she'd made that promise. Weekends were just longer versions of weekdays now, filled with the same routines stretched across more hours. David appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his navy suit, tie perfectly knotted, checking his phone with the intense focus he usually reserved for work presentations. At 41, he still carried himself with the confidence that had first attracted her 15 years ago, but something had shifted in the space between them. Not dramatically, not obviously, just gradually, like the way seasons change. "I'll be late tonight," he said, still scrolling through emails. "The Peterson account needs those revisions, and Martinez—" He paused, glancing up with a slightly embarrassed smile. "Sorry, different Martinez? You know what I mean." Rebecca nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course. I'll save you a plate." He moved toward her, planting a quick kiss on her cheek. The same spot, the same duration, the same casual affection that had somehow become more routine than romance. "You're the best, Becca. Don't know what I'd do without you." The words should have warmed her, but instead they settled heavy in her chest. She watched him grab his coffee mug, check his phone one more time, and head toward the door. "Love you," he called over his shoulder, a phrase that had become more farewell than feeling. "Love you too," she responded, the words automatic. After the flurry of backpacks, lunch boxes, and last-minute searches for homework, the house fell into its familiar silence. Rebecca stood in the entryway, watching David's car disappear around the corner, followed by the yellow school bus that swallowed her children until 3 o'clock. The quiet that descended wasn't peaceful. It was profound and pressing, like being underwater. She walked through the house, straightening pillows that didn't need straightening, wiping counters that were already clean. The living room bore the evidence of a family's life. Emma's art supplies scattered on the coffee table from last night's project, Marcus's soccer ball forgotten by the couch, David's reading glasses on the side table next to a financial magazine she'd never seen him actually read. In the bathroom mirror, Rebecca caught sight of herself and paused. When had the soft lines around her eyes become so pronounced? When had her brown hair started showing those first silver threads she kept meaning to color, but somehow never found time for? She was still attractive. People told her so, especially other mothers at school pickup who complimented her appearance with the enthusiasm of women desperate to find something positive to say to each other. But looking at herself now, she felt like she was seeing a stranger. Not because she looked different, but because she couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at herself as Rebecca, rather than as mom, or David's wife, or the woman who organized the school fundraiser. The day stretched ahead of her with its familiar rhythm. Grocery shopping at Whole Foods, where she'd run into other mothers and exchange pleasantries about soccer schedules and weekend plans. Then the dry cleaner for David's shirts, the pharmacy for Marcus's allergy medication, maybe a quick stop at Target for household necessities. Each errand a small interaction with the outside world that somehow left her feeling more isolated than before. By noon, she was standing in the cereal aisle at King's Supers, staring at dozens of colorful boxes and feeling overwhelmed by choices that shouldn't matter, but somehow did. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister Elena in Phoenix. "How's everything going? Kids good?" Rebecca typed back quickly. "All good. Busy as always." She added the emoji because Elena worried when her messages seemed too short, and Rebecca had learned that a simple smiley face could prevent concerned follow-up calls. But as she stood there holding her phone, surrounded by the hum of grocery store fluorescents and the distant sound of shopping carts, Rebecca felt the weight of that lie settle around her shoulders. Everything wasn't good. The kids were fine, David was fine, the house was fine, their finances were fine. Everything was objectively, measurably fine, except for her. The loneliness had crept up so gradually that she'd mistaken it for normal adjustment. When Emma started middle school and needed her less, when Marcus became more independent, when David's promotion meant longer hours and more travel, she'd told herself this was natural progression. Empty nest syndrome preparing to land, except her nest wasn't empty yet. She was just invisible in it. At home, she put away groceries with mechanical efficiency, her mind wandering to the book club she'd joined last month. She'd been excited at first, grateful for adult conversation about something other than carpools and permission slips. But sitting in Linda Morrison's pristine living room last Tuesday, listening to the other women dissect the latest literary fiction selection, she'd realized she had nothing meaningful to contribute. Not because she hadn't read the book, but because she'd forgotten how to have opinions that weren't filtered through everyone else's needs first. "I thought the protagonist was selfish," Margaret Chen had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Leaving her family to find herself, it's so self-indulgent. Rebecca had nodded along, but privately she'd envied the fictional woman's courage. At least she'd done something, even if it was wrong. Rebecca couldn't remember the last time she'd done anything that felt authentically hers. The afternoon brought its own rhythms. She folded laundry while watching a cooking show, wondering when food had become just fuel instead of creativity. The chef on screen talked about passion and flavor with such enthusiasm that Rebecca felt a strange pang of loss for feelings she couldn't quite name. When 3 o'clock arrived, she drove to the school, joining the line of cars that snaked around the block. This was supposed to be connection time, brief conversations with other parents, updates about school events, the social fabric of community. But increasingly, Rebecca found herself going through the motions, smiling and nodding while feeling like she was watching everything through glass. "Rebecca!" called out Jennifer Walsh, approaching her car with the determined stride of someone with news to share. "Did you hear about the Fall Carnival Committee? They need volunteers for the planning meeting Thursday night." "Oh," Rebecca said, rolling down her window. "I'm not sure if I can—" "Perfect! I'll put you down for decorations. You always have such good taste." Jennifer was already making a note on her phone, the decision apparently made. Rebecca wanted to protest, to say she'd already committed to too many things that felt more like obligations than choices. But Jennifer was walking away, waving cheerfully, and the words died in Rebecca's throat. Marcus climbed into the back seat, grass stains on his jeans and his typical post-school energy. "Can we get ice cream?" "Not today, buddy. We need to get home so you can start homework." "But Tyler's mom got him ice cream," Marcus argued with the logic of 9-year-olds everywhere. Rebecca caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Tyler's mom isn't your mom." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and Marcus fell silent. Rebecca felt immediate guilt. He was just being a kid, asking for ice cream, and she'd responded like his simple request was a personal attack. But lately, everything felt like too much, even the small things. Emma emerged from the school's main entrance, backpack slung over one shoulder, talking animatedly with her best friend Zoe. She hugged Zoe goodbye and jogged toward the car, sliding into the passenger seat with the dramatic sigh that had become her signature greeting. "How was school?" Rebecca asked, pulling away from the curb. "Fine," Emma replied, already pulling out her phone. "What does fine mean? Good fine or bad fine?" Emma glanced up with the look of someone forced to explain something obvious. "Just fine, Mom. Normal. Regular fine." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the futility of pushing for more. Emma was 12, which meant she was caught between childhood and teenage years, and Rebecca was caught between being needed and being an embarrassment. It was natural, she knew, but it felt like another small loss in a series she was only beginning to recognize. That evening, David called at 6:30 to say he'd be even later than expected. Rebecca fed the kids, supervised homework, refereed an argument about television time, and managed the complex logistics of bedtime routines. By the time both children were settled, it was nearly 9 o'clock. She poured herself a glass of wine, something she'd been doing more frequently lately, and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, telling herself she'd catch up on emails or maybe research that online course she'd been thinking about. Instead, she found herself scrolling through social media, looking at carefully curated glimpses of other people's lives. Her high school friend Amanda had posted photos from a weekend trip to Napa with her husband, candid shots of wine tasting and sunset dinners that radiated joy and connection. Her college roommate Lisa had shared pictures from her art studio, her hands covered in paint, her face bright with the satisfaction of creative work. Even her neighbor Patricia, whom she'd always considered happily ordinary, had posted about starting salsa dancing classes with her husband. Everyone seemed to be living, while Rebecca felt like she was merely existing. When David finally arrived home at 10:45, Rebecca was still at the kitchen table, the wine barely touched, staring at a blank document on her laptop screen. She'd intended to write something, maybe start a journal or draft a letter to her sister, or even just make a list of things she wanted to change. But the cursor had blinked at her for an hour, and she had nothing to say. "Hey," David said, loosening his tie as he entered the kitchen. "Sorry so late." The Peterson thing turned into a whole crisis situation. He moved to the refrigerator, pulling out the plate she'd covered for him. "You didn't have to wait up." "I wasn't waiting up," Rebecca said, though they both knew that wasn't quite true. "Just couldn't sleep." David looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw something flicker across his face. Concern, maybe, or curiosity. But then he was heating his dinner in the microwave, telling her about office politics and client demands. And the moment passed. "How are the kids today?" he asked, settling across from her with his reheated meatloaf. "Good. Emma has that book report due Friday. Marcus needs cleats for soccer. His feet grew again." David nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "I can pick up cleats this weekend if you want." "That would help." They fell into comfortable silence, the kind that had once felt intimate, but now felt more like parallel solitude. Rebecca watched her husband eat, noting the way his shoulders held tension from his long day, the way his eyes were already slightly unfocused with tiredness. He was a good man, a good father, a good provider. He worked hard to give their family security and comfort. So, why did she feel like they were strangers sharing a kitchen? "David," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "Hmm?" He looked up, fork halfway to his mouth. The words she wanted to say crowded in her throat. "I'm lonely. I feel invisible. I don't know who I am anymore outside of taking care of everyone else. I love our family, but I'm disappearing in it." Instead, she said, "Never mind. Just tired." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. "You work too hard, Becca. Maybe you should take a day for yourself this weekend. Get a massage or something. A massage, as if what she needed was physical relaxation rather than existential restoration." But Rebecca nodded and smiled because David was trying to be kind, and she didn't know how to explain that the problem wasn't that she needed pampering, it was that she needed purpose. Later, lying in bed while David slept beside her, Rebecca stared at the ceiling and listened to the familiar sounds of her house settling around her. The heater cycling on, the old pipes creaking, the distant sound of a car passing on their quiet street. Tomorrow would be another day exactly like today, and the day after that would be the same, and she could see the pattern stretching endlessly ahead of her until Emma and Marcus were grown and gone, and she was left with nothing but clean houses and organized calendars and the echo of a life she'd forgotten to live. For the first time in years, Rebecca allowed herself to cry. Not the frustrated tears of overwhelming days or the sentimental tears of children's milestones, but deep, quiet tears for the woman she'd been and the woman she feared she'd never become again. The tears felt foreign and necessary, like rain after a long drought, and she let them come until exhaustion finally carried her into dreamless sleep. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. Rebecca woke to the sound of October rain drumming against the bedroom windows, the kind of steady downpour that turned Denver's autumn leaves into soggy carpets and made everything feel muted and gray. David's side of the bed was already empty, the sheets cool to the touch. He'd started leaving for work even earlier lately, chasing some promotion opportunity he'd mentioned in passing, but never really explained. She lay still for a moment, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of her children getting ready for school, without her immediate supervision. When had that happened? When had Emma become capable of making her own breakfast and helping Marcus find his homework? The independence she'd worked so hard to foster now felt like another small rejection, another way she was becoming unnecessary. Downstairs, she found Emma at the kitchen counter, methodically spreading peanut butter on toast while Marcus sat at the table, concentrating on math homework with the intense focus of someone trying to finish before the bus arrived. "Morning, Mom," Emma said without looking up, her tone casual but not unkind. "I made Marcus toast too, and I checked. He has his lunch money." "Thank you, sweetheart." Rebecca moved toward the coffee maker, feeling oddly displaced in her own kitchen. "How did you sleep?" "Good. Oh, and Zoe's mom said she could drive me to soccer practice after school if that helps." Another small piece of Rebecca's purpose, casually redistributed. "That's fine," she said, though she wondered if Linda Morrison was one of those mothers who collected other people's children as a way of collecting social currency. "Just make sure you thank her." The morning routine proceeded with unusual efficiency, her children moving through their preparations with the kind of independence that should have made her proud, but instead left her feeling superfluous. When the bus arrived, Emma grabbed her backpack and Marcus's, herding her younger brother toward the door with the competence of someone far older than 12. "Love you, Mom," Marcus called over his shoulder, his goodbye cheerful and automatic. "See you later," Emma added, and then they were gone, leaving Rebecca alone with her coffee and the sound of rain against the windows. She found herself at the kitchen sink again, mechanically wiping down counters that didn't need cleaning, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Rebecca hesitated before answering. Margaret Rodriguez had never quite forgiven Rebecca for leaving her teaching job to become a stay-at-home mother, and their conversations lately had become minefields of gentle criticism disguised as concern. "Mija," her mother's voice carried the warmth that had comforted Rebecca through childhood's scraped knees and broken hearts. "How are you? You sounded tired when we talked last week." "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy with the kids' schedules. You know how it is." Margaret's non-committal hum suggested she knew exactly how it was, and disapproved. "And David? Still working those long hours?" "He's up for a promotion. It's important for his career." Another pause. "And what about your career, Rebecca? You were such a good teacher. Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store still asks about you, you know. She remembers how you helped her grandson with reading." Rebecca closed her eyes. Her mother meant well, but these conversations always left her feeling like she was defending choices she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. "I'm taking care of my family, Mom. That's important too." "Of course it is. But you're also a person, not just a wife and mother. When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rebecca couldn't answer it because she couldn't remember. Even her book club felt more like another obligation than personal enjoyment. "I should go," Rebecca said finally. "I have errands to run." "All right, Mija, but think about what I said. You don't have to disappear to take care of everyone else." After hanging up, Rebecca stood in her kitchen feeling caught between worlds. Too guilty to admit her mother was right, too stubborn to accept that her choices might need changing. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and she made a sudden decision. Instead of her usual errands, she drove to the Denver Art Museum. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done something purely because she wanted to, without considering anyone else's needs or schedules. The museum was quiet on a weekday morning, populated mostly by tourists and a few other people who, like her, seemed to be seeking something they couldn't quite name. She wandered through the contemporary exhibits, stopping before a large canvas painted in layers of blue and gray that somehow captured exactly how she'd been feeling. Not sad exactly, but muted, like she was viewing the world through frosted glass. A small placard beside the painting explained that the artist had created the piece during a period of personal transition, exploring themes of identity and transformation. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice beside her. Rebecca turned to find a woman about her own age, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a messy bun and paint-stained fingertips that suggested she was an artist herself. Her eyes were kind, with the crinkles that came from someone who smiled frequently. "It is," Rebecca agreed. "There's something about it that feels familiar." The woman nodded knowingly. "Sarah Chen, the artist, she talked about this piece in an interview I read. She said she painted it when she realized she'd become invisible to herself, spent so many years being what other people needed her to be that she forgot who she actually was." Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, a recognition so profound it was almost physical. "That's, very relatable." "I'm Iris, by the way," the woman said, extending a paint-stained hand. "Iris Kumar. I teach art therapy at the community center downtown." "Rebecca Martinez." She shook Iris's hand, noting how confident her grip was, how present she seemed in her own skin. "Are you an artist, Rebecca?" "Oh no, I mean, I used to paint a little in college, but that was years ago. I'm just..." She paused, unsure how to finish the sentence. What was she? "I'm a mom. My kids are at school, and I had some free time." Iris smiled, but not in the patronizing way Rebecca had come to expect when she introduced herself as just a mom. Instead, her expression held genuine interest. "Free time is precious. What drew you here today?" Rebecca looked back at the blue and gray painting, trying to articulate something she'd never said out loud. "I think I needed to remember what it feels like to want something. Not need something or have to do something, but actually want something for no reason other than it appeals to me. And do you want something, I mean?" The question should have been simple, but Rebecca found herself struggling to answer. When was the last time she'd asked herself what she wanted? Not what her family needed, not what would be practical or responsible, but what she genuinely desired? "I don't know," she said finally, the honesty of it both frightening and liberating. Iris nodded as if this was the most natural answer in the world. "That's okay. Not knowing is the beginning of finding out. Would you like to grab coffee? There's a little place around the corner that does excellent cappuccinos." Rebecca's first instinct was to decline. She had groceries to buy, David's dry cleaning to pick up, a dozen small tasks that would fill her day with purpose, if not meaning. But something in Iris's invitation felt different from the social obligations she usually navigated. It felt like genuine connection. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself. The coffee shop was the kind of place Rebecca never would have discovered on her own, small and eclectic, with mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls. Iris ordered for them both, somehow intuiting that Rebecca would want a cappuccino with extra foam, and they settled into a corner booth with mugs that were clearly handmade. "So," Iris said, settling back in her chair with the comfort of someone who spent a lot of time in coffee shops. "Tell me about your life, Rebecca Martinez. What's your story?" It was such an open-ended question that Rebecca almost laughed. "My story? I don't think I have much of one. I've been married to David for 13 years. We have 2 kids, Emma and Marcus. I used to teach 5th grade, but I stopped when Emma was born to stay home with the kids. David's in marketing. He's doing really well, actually. We live in Stapleton, nice neighborhood, good schools." She trailed off, realizing she'd just described her circumstances but hadn't said anything about herself. "That's a nice foundation," Iris said carefully. "But what about you? What do you love? What makes you laugh? What pisses you off?" Rebecca stared at her, caught off guard by the directness of the questions. I'm not sure I remember. Okay, let's try something easier. What did you love when you were younger, before all the responsibilities?" Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to reach back through years of PTA meetings and grocery lists to find the person she used to be. I loved teaching, she said slowly. Not just the curriculum, but really connecting with kids, helping them discover they were capable of more than they thought. And I loved making things. I used to sew and paint, and I had this little herb garden. I liked taking something raw and turning it into something beautiful or useful. What happened to that person? She had children, Rebecca said automatically, then immediately felt guilty. I don't regret having kids. I love Emma and Marcus more than anything. Of course you do, but loving your children and losing yourself don't have to go together. Iris leaned forward, her expression gentle but intense. I see this all the time in my work. Women who give so much of themselves to their families that they forget they were whole people before they became mothers and wives. The tragedy isn't that they chose their families, it's that they think choosing their families means they can't also choose themselves. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. I feel like I'm disappearing, she whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. Tell me about that. Everything I do is about other people. I organize David's schedule, manage the kids' activities, keep the house running, volunteer at school because they need help, join committees because someone has to. Even when I try to do something for myself, like the book club, I end up feeling like I'm performing the role of someone who has interests rather than actually having them. Iris nodded, her expression full of understanding rather than judgment. How long has it been since you made a decision based purely on what you wanted? Rebecca thought about it, going back through weeks and months and years of choices made for practical reasons or other people's needs. I honestly can't remember. That must be exhausting. The simple acknowledgement broke something loose in Rebecca's chest. It is. And the worst part is, I feel guilty for even admitting that. I have a good life. David's a good husband. The kids are healthy and smart. We're financially stable. I should be grateful, not complaining. Gratitude and fulfillment aren't mutually exclusive, Iris said softly. You can be grateful for what you have and still recognize that you need more. That doesn't make you selfish. It makes you human. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the rain still pattering against the coffee shop windows. Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the simple pleasure of being truly heard by another person. Can I ask you something? Rebecca said finally. Of course. How did you figure it out? How did you become someone who seems so comfortable in your own skin? Iris laughed, a sound full of warmth and self-awareness. Oh, honey, it wasn't always like this. I spent 15 years married to a man who loved me but had very specific ideas about who I should be. I was the perfect corporate wife. Organized his social events, managed his household, smiled prettily at dinner parties. Then one day I woke up and realized I had no idea what my favorite color was because I'd spent so long choosing colors that complemented his vision of our life together. What did you do? I started small. I took an art class just one evening a week. My husband thought it was a nice hobby, but for me, it was like remembering I had hands, that I could create something that came entirely from my own mind and heart. From there, it grew. More classes, then teaching, then therapy training. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living someone else's idea of my life. Did you get divorced? We did. It was hard. Probably the hardest thing I've ever done. But we're both happier now. He's remarried to a woman who genuinely enjoys the life he wants to live. And I'm here, covered in paint half the time and absolutely loving it. Rebecca absorbed this, trying to imagine having that kind of courage. I don't think I could do that. David's not a bad husband. And the kids, I'm not suggesting you should get divorced, Iris said quickly. Every situation is different. But maybe you could start small, like I did. What's one thing you could do for yourself just because you want to? Rebecca thought about it, and suddenly an image popped into her mind. Herself at an easel, paintbrush in hand, completely absorbed in mixing colors and creating something from nothing. I used to paint, she said slowly. In college, I took studio classes. I was pretty good, actually, but I stopped when I got busy with student teaching and then work and then life, Iris finished. It happens to the best of us. But here's the thing about painting. It's patient. It waits for you. I don't even have supplies anymore, and I wouldn't know where to set up in the house." "Excuses," Iris said gently but firmly. "I'm not saying you have to become the next Georgia O'Keeffe overnight. But what if you just bought a small set of watercolors and some paper? What if you painted for 20 minutes while your kids do homework? What if you gave yourself permission to be bad at something just for the joy of trying?" The idea sent a flutter of excitement through Rebecca's chest, followed immediately by a wave of practical concerns. Where would she keep the supplies? When would she find time? What would David think? As if reading her mind, Iris said, "I teach a community class on Saturday mornings. 2 hours, all levels welcome, $5 to cover materials. No pressure, no judgment, just people making art because it feels good. You should come." "I couldn't," Rebecca said automatically. "Saturday mornings are busy with the kids' activities." "Well, what time do their activities start?" "Marcus has soccer at 11 and Emma has... My class is from 9 to 11. You could do both." Rebecca felt the familiar weight of logistics settling on her shoulders. "But I'd have to arrange for someone to watch them, and David usually sleeps in on Saturdays because he works such long hours during the week." "Rebecca." Iris's voice was kind but direct. "Listen to yourself. You're coming up with reasons why you can't spend 2 hours a week doing something you might love. What does that tell you?" The question hit like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Rebecca had become so accustomed to organizing her life around everyone else's needs that the idea of claiming space for herself felt almost transgressive. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Of what?" Of what happens if I start wanting things again. What if I like it too much? What if it makes me dissatisfied with everything else? What if I'm not as good as I used to be? Or what if I am good and then I want more than just a hobby? What if you remember that you're a whole person?" Iris interrupted gently. "Rebecca, you're not going to destroy your family by taking an art class, but you might save yourself." They parted ways outside the coffee shop, Iris pressing a business card into Rebecca's hand with the community center address written on the back. "Saturday mornings," she repeated, 9 to 11. "Just show up if you want to. No commitment beyond trying." Driving home through the rain, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. Not certainty, not a grand plan, but the simple, radical idea that she might be allowed to want something just for herself. That afternoon, she found herself standing in the art supply aisle at Target, holding a basic watercolor set like it was a dangerous weapon. 24 colors, 3 brushes, a pad of paper, nothing fancy, but it represented something huge. As she placed it in her cart, her heart was beating like she was committing a crime. At home, she hid the supplies in her bedroom closet, feeling simultaneously foolish and defiant. She told herself she was just keeping her options open, that she probably wouldn't even use them. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside her, she thought about colors and possibilities, and the woman she used to be who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to reach for it. Chapter 3. The Color of Truth. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Colorado autumn weather that made everything feel muted and expectant. Rebecca woke before her alarm, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and anxiety that reminded her of the first day of school when she was 8 years old. She lay still for a moment, listening to David's steady breathing beside her, and almost talked herself out of going. But she'd spent the week thinking about her conversation with Iris, and every excuse she'd invented had sounded increasingly hollow. Marcus's soccer practice didn't start until 11. Emma was sleeping over at Zoe's house. David could handle 2 hours alone in his own house. She had no real reason not to go except fear, and that seemed like the worst reason of all. She dressed quietly, jeans and an old sweater she hadn't worn in months, and left a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to run errands. Back by 11:30. Love you." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and she felt a stab of guilt about the omission. The Denver Community Arts Center occupied a converted warehouse in the Rhino District, the kind of neighborhood Rebecca usually only drove through on her way to somewhere else. She parked her minivan between a paint-splattered pickup truck and a small hybrid covered in bumper stickers, feeling conspicuously suburban and out of place. Inside, the building hummed with creative energy. The walls were lined with local artwork, and she could hear the distant sounds of a pottery wheel spinning and someone playing guitar. She followed the signs to Studio B, where she found Iris arranging supplies on a long table while soft jazz played from a small speaker. "Rebecca!" Iris looked genuinely pleased to see her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," Rebecca admitted, hovering near the doorway like she might bolt at any moment. Come in. We're pretty casual here. Grab an easel wherever you want, though I'd recommend somewhere with good natural light if you can find it." The room held about 15 easels arranged in a loose circle, with a still life arrangement in the center. Nothing fancy, just some fruit and pottery and an interesting piece of driftwood that caught the light in unexpected ways. Other students were already settling in, and Rebecca was surprised by the diversity of ages and backgrounds. She'd expected a room full of artistic types in flowing scarves and paint-stained aprons, but instead found a mix that included a man in scrubs who'd apparently come straight from a hospital shift, an elderly woman with carefully styled gray hair, and a teenager with purple streaks who was setting up with the confidence of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. Rebecca claimed an easel near the window and arranged her humble supplies, feeling underdressed compared to the elaborate paint boxes and professional brushes surrounding her. But when Iris clapped her hands to gather attention, that self-consciousness faded into the background. "All right, everyone," Iris said, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Today we're working on seeing, not thinking about what we know things should look like, but really observing what's in front of us. Colors, shadows, the way light falls across surfaces. Don't worry about making it perfect. Worry about making it true to what you see." Rebecca picked up her brush with hands that trembled slightly, surprised by how foreign it felt after so many years. She squeezed a small amount of yellow ochre onto her paper palette, the color bright and optimistic against the white surface. When she mixed it with a touch of burnt sienna, something clicked in her muscle memory, and she found herself remembering the satisfaction of watching colors transform into something new. The first strokes were tentative, almost apologetic. She kept glancing around to see what others were doing, comparing her hesitant marks to the confident gestures of more experienced painters. But gradually, as she lost herself in the process of really looking at the apple in front of her, not the generic apple of her imagination, but this specific piece of fruit with its particular combination of red and yellow and green, the way the light caught the slight depression near its stem, the self-consciousness began to fade. "Don't think so much," Iris said quietly, appearing beside her easel. "Trust your eye, trust your hand." Rebecca nodded, taking a breath and letting her brush move more freely across the paper. The apple that emerged wasn't perfect, wasn't gallery-worthy, but it was hers in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. For the first time in years, she was creating something that existed purely because she wanted it to exist. "That's beautiful," said a voice to her left. Rebecca glanced over to find the elderly woman with the carefully styled hair admiring her work. "You have a lovely sense of color." "Thank you," Rebecca said, surprised by how much the simple compliment meant to her. "I'm pretty rusty." "We all are, dear. That's what makes it interesting." The woman extended a paint-stained hand. "I'm Dorothy Chen. I've been coming here for 3 years. Ever since my husband passed. Never painted a day in my life before that. But it turns out grief makes you try all sorts of new things." Rebecca shook her hand, noting the strength in Dorothy's grip despite her delicate appearance. "I'm Rebecca. I'm sorry about your husband." "Thank you. He was a good man, but he had very specific ideas about how we should spend our time. Golf, bridge, dinner parties with his colleagues, all perfectly nice activities, but not particularly me, if you know what I mean." Rebecca nodded, understanding more than Dorothy might have expected. "What made you try painting?" Dorothy smiled, an expression that transformed her entire face. "I was cleaning out Harold's study and found a box of my old things from before we married. College transcripts, some poetry I'd written, sketches I'd made during a trip to Europe. I'd forgotten I'd ever done any of those things. It was like finding artifacts from someone else's life, except that someone had been me." The words resonated in Rebecca's chest like a tuning fork. She thought about the boxes in her own attic, filled with lesson plans she'd loved creating, photographs from teaching field trips, thank you notes from students who'd graduated years ago. When had she stopped thinking of those things as part of who she was? "So, you decided to paint?" "I decided to try. At first, Harold would have been horrified. All this mess and expense for what he would have called a hobby. But you know what I discovered? It's not a hobby when it feeds your soul. It's necessity disguised as recreation. They painted in comfortable silence for a while, the room filled with the quiet sounds of brushes on paper and the soft conversations that spring up naturally among people absorbed in creative work. Rebecca found herself mixing colors with increasing confidence, laying down washes of blue-gray for shadows, building up the form of her apple with layers of transparent color that seemed to glow from within. At some point, she became aware that the man in scrubs, who'd introduced himself as Carlos when he'd helped her reach paper towels, was working on something completely different from the still life arrangement. Instead of fruit and pottery, his paper was covered with abstract swirls of color that seemed to move and dance across the surface. "That's incredible," Rebecca said during a break, when Iris encouraged everyone to walk around and see what others were creating. Carlos looked up from his work, his dark eyes tired but bright with creative energy. "Thanks. I work emergency room shifts at Presbyterian, and sometimes I need to paint out all the intensity, you know? All that life and death and adrenaline. It has to go somewhere." "Do you always paint abstracts?" "Usually, though sometimes I try to capture specific moments. Last week I painted the sunrise I saw driving home after a particularly hard shift. There'd been a car accident, family with young kids, and by the time we stabilized everyone, I was pretty wrung out. But driving home, I saw this incredible sunrise, all pink and gold and purple, and it felt like the world reminding me that beauty exists alongside pain." Rebecca studied his painting with new eyes, seeing not just pleasing colors, but emotional expression, a way of processing experience that went beyond words. "I used to teach elementary school," she found herself saying. "5th grade. I loved it, but I stopped when I had kids. Do you miss it?" The question was simple, but Rebecca felt its complexity reverberate through her. "I thought I didn't," she said slowly. "I convinced myself that being home with my children was more important, more fulfilling. But lately, you're wondering if maybe you can love your kids and still miss the work that made you feel like yourself." Rebecca stared at him, amazed at how effortlessly he'd articulated something she'd been struggling to understand. "Exactly. I get it. I have 2 teenagers at home, and there was a period when my ex-wife wanted me to take a desk job, something with regular hours and better pay. She thought it would be better for the family. And maybe she was right, practically speaking. But every time I tried to imagine giving up emergency medicine, I felt like I was planning my own funeral. What did you happen?" Carlos shrugged, but not dismissively. "We got divorced, not because she was wrong to want stability for our family, and not because I was wrong to need work that felt meaningful. We just wanted different things, and we couldn't figure out how to want them together." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. "Do you regret it?" "The divorce? Some days. But I don't regret refusing to become someone I wasn't. And honestly, my kids respect me more now that I'm authentically myself instead of trying to be some version of a father I thought they needed." Before Rebecca could respond, Iris called the group back together for the final portion of class. "Let's spend our last few minutes talking about what we discovered today. Not about technique, or whether your painting looks right, but about what the process felt like." One by one, people shared their experiences. The teenager with purple hair talked about how painting helped her process anxiety. Dorothy mentioned the joy of making marks that belonged entirely to her. Carlos described the relief of expressing emotions that didn't fit into words. When it was Rebecca's turn, she looked down at her apple, imperfect but honest, a representation of something real that she'd created with her own hands. "I forgot," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear. "I forgot that I was someone who made things, not just meals and clean houses and organized schedules, but actual things that didn't exist until I decided to create them." The room was silent for a moment, and Rebecca worried she'd shared too much. But then Iris smiled, and Rebecca saw recognition in her eyes, not just of artistic ability, but of something being awakened. "That's what art does," Iris said gently. "It reminds us that we're creators, not just caretakers." After class, Rebecca lingered, reluctant to leave the space that had felt so alive with possibility. She helped Iris clean brushes and put away supplies, enjoying the simple intimacy of shared work with someone who understood the importance of what had just happened. "How do you feel?" Iris asked as they folded the last paper towels. Different, Rebecca said, then laughed at how inadequate the word was. Good different. Scared different. Like I remembered something I didn't know I'd forgotten. Are you going to keep painting? Rebecca thought about the watercolor set hidden in her bedroom closet, about the logistics of finding time and space in her carefully organized life. I want to, she said, but I don't know how to fit it in without everything else falling apart. What if everything else didn't fall apart? What if your family is more resilient than you think? What if taking care of yourself actually made you better at taking care of them? The questions followed Rebecca as she drove home, her fingers still faintly stained with paint, and her mind buzzing with colors and possibilities. She arrived to find David in the kitchen making pancakes while Marcus sat at the counter, still in his pajamas, telling an elaborate story about a dream involving soccer-playing dinosaurs. "Hey," David said, glancing up from the stove. "How are your errands?" "Good," Rebecca said, the half-truth sitting uneasily in her stomach. "Productive." "Mom, look." Marcus held up a drawing he'd been working on. "It's you and me and Emma and Dad, but we're all superheroes." Rebecca studied the drawing, noting the care Marcus had taken with the details, the way he'd drawn her with a cape covered in flowers, how he'd given David the power of organization, represented by a briefcase that shot lightning bolts, and how he'd made Emma's superpower the ability to talk to animals. "What's my superpower?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Growing things," Marcus said matter-of-factly, like gardens and cookies and making people feel better when they're sad. Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of how her son saw her paired with a sudden understanding that nurturing others and nurturing herself weren't mutually exclusive. "That's a pretty good superpower," she said, ruffling his hair. "The best," Marcus agreed, then bounded off to get dressed for soccer. As Rebecca helped David finish breakfast preparations, she found herself really looking at her kitchen for the first time in months. The morning light streaming through the windows, the way steam rose from their coffee cups, the comfortable choreography of their shared domestic routine. It was beautiful in its own way, worthy of attention and appreciation. But it wasn't everything. It was part of her life, an important part, but not the totality of who she was or could be. "David," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "Yeah?" He was focused on flipping pancakes, but she could tell he was listening. "What would you think if I started painting again, like I used to in college?" He paused, spatula in midair, and looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Painting? Where did that come from?" "I've been thinking about it lately. Missing it, I guess. I wondered if maybe I could set up a small space somewhere in the house. Maybe take a class or two." "That sounds great, Becca. You were really good at that stuff, weren't you? I remember you showed me some of your college work when we were dating." The easy acceptance in his voice caught her off guard. She'd been prepared for resistance, for practical concerns about time and money and mess. Instead, he seemed genuinely pleased by the idea. "You wouldn't mind? The supplies and the time commitment and everything?" David turned to face her fully, his expression slightly puzzled. "Why would I mind you having a hobby? You're always telling me I should golf more or join that cycling group from work. Why wouldn't I want the same thing for you? A hobby." The word stung slightly, but Rebecca recognized that David was trying to be supportive in the only framework he understood, and maybe that was enough for now. Maybe she could start with hobby and see where it led. "Where would you set up?" he continued. "The dining room? We hardly use it except for holidays." "Actually," Rebecca said, an idea forming as she spoke, "what about the basement? That corner by the window gets good light, and there's already a utility sink for cleanup. Perfect. We could get you one of those adjustable tables, maybe some storage shelves. Want to go look at stuff after Marcus's soccer practice?" The offer was so practical, so David-like in its immediate move toward problem-solving, that Rebecca felt a rush of affection for her husband. He might not understand the deeper currents of what she was feeling, but he was willing to help her navigate them. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. That afternoon, at the home improvement store, Rebecca found herself in the unexpected position of being consulted about her own needs. David asked questions about lighting and ventilation and storage with the same focused attention he brought to work projects. Marcus, still energized from soccer, offered enthusiastic, if impractical, suggestions about paint colors for the walls and the merits of various organizational systems. Standing in the aisle surrounded by possibilities, adjustable tables and storage solutions and task lighting, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the The sense that her desires mattered enough to be planned for, budgeted for, made real. "What about easels?" David asked, consulting the list they'd been making. "Do you need one of those wooden triangular things?" "Maybe eventually," Rebecca said, thinking of the room at the community center with its circle of easels and creative energy. "But I think I'll start small, just the table and maybe a few basic supplies." "Whatever you want," David said, and Rebecca could tell he meant it. "I'm just glad you found something you're excited about. You've seemed kind of, I don't know, restless lately." Restless. It wasn't wrong exactly, but it wasn't complete either. She'd been restless the way a plant is restless when it's outgrown its pot, not because anything was wrong with the pot, but because growth requires space to expand into. That evening, after they'd assembled the adjustable table in the basement corner and Rebecca had arranged her modest supplies with the care of someone creating a shrine, she stood back and surveyed her new creative space. It wasn't much, a folding table, a desk lamp, a few brushes and tubes of paint, but it felt like a declaration of independence. Emma, who'd returned from her sleepover full of stories about 12-year-old drama and elaborate plans for Halloween costumes, wandered downstairs to investigate the activity. "What's all this?" she asked, examining Rebecca's setup with the critical eye of someone who took art classes at school and had opinions about supplies. "I'm going to start painting again," Rebecca said, "like I used to do in college." Emma nodded approvingly. "Cool. Mrs. Patterson says art is good for your mental health. She makes us do these meditation drawings when people get stressed about tests." "Smart teacher." "Yeah. Are you going to paint pictures of us?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. "Would you want me to?" Emma shrugged with 12-year-old nonchalance, but Rebecca caught the hint of pleased interest in her expression. "Maybe, if they're good." "I'll practice first," Rebecca said, smiling. "Make sure they're good enough for my toughest critic." "I'm not that tough," Emma protested, but she was grinning. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and David was absorbed in work emails, Rebecca found herself drawn back to the basement. She didn't plan to paint. It was late, and she was tired, and she hadn't really thought about what she wanted to create. But she wanted to sit in the space, to feel its potential. She turned on the desk lamp and arranged a few objects on the table. An apple from the fruit bowl, a ceramic mug David had made in a pottery class years ago, a small succulent plant Emma had given her for Mother's Day. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required artistic genius to capture. Just simple things made interesting by attention and light. She squeezed a small amount of yellow ochre onto her palette, the same color she'd started with that morning at the community center. But this time, instead of tentative marks, she found herself painting with purpose. Not because the result would be beautiful or important, but because the act itself felt necessary. Like breathing, or stretching, or any other thing the body needs to do to stay healthy. As she worked, she thought about Dorothy Chen and her rediscovered boxes of poetry and sketches. About Carlos painting sunrises to process the intensity of his work. About Iris, who'd had the courage to leave a life that looked perfect from the outside because it felt empty on the inside. She thought about Marcus's drawing of their family as superheroes, and his certainty that her power was growing things and making people feel better. Maybe that was true. Maybe she could grow more than just gardens and children. Maybe she could grow herself back into someone she recognized, someone who existed as more than just the space between other people's needs. The apple on her paper began to take shape. Not perfect, not gallery-worthy, but real and honest and entirely hers. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca Martinez felt like she was exactly where she belonged, in the messy, uncertain, beautiful process of becoming herself again. Chapter 4. New colors, same canvas. 3 weeks after setting up her basement studio, Rebecca had developed a routine that felt both revolutionary and natural. Every morning after David left for work and the kids caught their bus, she would spend an hour painting. Not long enough to lose track of time completely, not so short as to feel rushed, just long enough to remember that she was someone who created things. She'd painted 17 small studies so far, apples and coffee cups and the view from her kitchen window, but also more ambitious subjects that surprised her. Last Tuesday, she'd attempted to capture the expression on Marcus's face when he was absorbed in reading, the particular quality of concentration that made him look both younger and older than his 9 years. Yesterday, she'd tried to paint the way afternoon light fell across Emma's unmade bed, all golden and soft, and somehow full of her daughter's personality even in her absence. The paintings weren't masterpieces, but they were honest, and that felt like enough for now. This particular Thursday morning, Rebecca stood in her studio holding a letter that had arrived in yesterday's mail. The envelope was thick cream paper with the Denver Public Schools logo, and inside was an invitation she'd read 3 times without quite believing it was real. "Dear Mrs. Martinez," it began, "the administration at Columbine Elementary has an immediate opening for a long-term substitute position in our 5th grade program. Your former principal, Dr. Patricia Williams, recommended you highly and wondered if you might be interested in returning to teaching." Rebecca set the letter down and picked up her brush, needing the familiar comfort of mixing colors while she processed this unexpected possibility. Dr. Williams had been her mentor during her student teaching, the woman who'd convinced her she had a gift for connecting with children. They'd exchanged Christmas cards over the years, but Rebecca hadn't spoken to her in person since Emma was a toddler. The position would start after Thanksgiving and run through the end of the school year, covering for a teacher who was taking extended medical leave. 5th grade, her favorite age group, the same school district where she'd taught before, with colleagues who might still remember her. She squeezed ultramarine blue onto her palette and added a touch of burnt umber, creating the deep gray blue of November sky. Outside her basement window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, light flakes that caught the morning light like tiny prisms. The practical considerations crowded in immediately. Marcus would need after-school care. Emma's schedule would have to be adjusted, the house wouldn't clean itself, meals wouldn't magically appear, David's shirts wouldn't pick themselves up from the dry cleaner. For 8 years, she'd been the invisible infrastructure that allowed everyone else's life to run smoothly. But as she began laying down washes of color, blues and grays, and the warm undertones that made winter light so complex, Rebecca found herself imagining standing in front of a classroom again. 25 10-year-olds looking at her with the mixture of skepticism and hope that defined that age. The satisfaction of watching a struggling reader suddenly grasp a concept, or seeing a shy child discover they had something important to say. She painted for an hour, losing herself in the process of trying to capture the quality of light that made everything look hushed and expectant. When she finally set down her brush, she had something that looked remarkably like the morning outside her window, but more than that, she had clarity. She wanted the job, not because she needed to escape her current life, but because teaching was part of who she was, and she'd been incomplete without it. The conversation with David that evening was easier than she'd expected and more complicated than she'd hoped. "That's incredible, Becca," he said, looking up from the letter with genuine enthusiasm. "Dr. Williams must really think highly of you to recommend you after all this time." "It would mean some big changes," Rebecca said carefully. "Childcare arrangements, different schedules, probably eating a lot more takeout. We can figure that stuff out. This is a great opportunity for you." His immediate support should have made her feel better, but something in his tone, the same enthusiastic problem-solving he brought to work challenges, made her pause. "David, do you know why I want to do this?" He looked puzzled by the question. "Because you're a great teacher? Because it's good to use your skills? Because the money would be nice with college funds and everything?" All practical reasons, all true to some extent, but not the heart of it. "Those are all factors," Rebecca said slowly. "But mostly, I want to do it because when I think about being in a classroom again, I feel like myself in a way I haven't in years." David nodded, but she could see he didn't quite understand the distinction she was making. "Well, whatever the reason, I'm proud of you for considering it. It takes guts to jump back into teaching after being away so long." They spent the rest of the evening working out logistics with the methodical efficiency that had always characterized their partnership. David would adjust his schedule to handle morning drop-offs twice a week. Emma could walk to Marcus's after-school program, and they could both take the late bus home. Rebecca would need to arrange coverage for the inevitable sick days and school holidays that didn't align with her children's schedule. It was all very reasonable and practical, and Rebecca felt simultaneously grateful for David's support and slightly hollow about how easily their life could be reorganized around her needs when those needs were finally articulated. The conversation with her children was more complex. "You want to be a teacher again?" Marcus asked over Saturday morning pancakes, his expression skeptical. "But you're already our mom." "I can be both," Rebecca assured him. "Lots of moms work. Mrs. Patterson works, and she's Tyler's mom." But you've always been here when we get home from school. The simple statement hit harder than Rebecca had expected. Marcus wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. He was just stating a fact that had defined his entire conscious life. She had always been there, ready with snacks and homework help and whatever emotional support the day had required. I know, buddy, and I've loved being here for you. But now you're both old enough that you don't need me every minute, and I'm thinking it might be good for me to teach other kids too. Emma, who'd been listening while scrolling through her phone with the selective attention of a 12-year-old, looked up with sudden interest. Would you be teaching kids our age? A little younger, 5th graders. That's cool. You'd be good at that. You're good at explaining stuff without making people feel stupid. The casual confidence in Emma's assessment surprised Rebecca. When had her daughter started seeing her as someone with skills beyond maternal ones? What if we need you and you're not here? Marcus persisted, his 9-year-old logic working through the implications. Rebecca set down her coffee mug and looked at both her children seriously. Then you'll call me and I'll help you figure out what to do. Just like when Dad's traveling for work, or when I have to run errands, or any other time I'm not physically in the same room with you. We'll work it out together. Can we visit your classroom? Marcus asked, apparently satisfied with her answer. If my principal says it's okay, absolutely. The following Monday, Rebecca called Dr. Williams to accept the position. The conversation was warm and encouraging, filled with updates about curriculum changes and new technologies, but also reassuring continuities, the same challenges and rewards that had drawn Rebecca to teaching in the first place. I won't lie to you, Rebecca, Dr. Williams said. You're going to be rusty at first. Classroom management, new standards, technology integration, there's been a lot of change since you left. But you have something that can't be taught. You genuinely like children. You remember what it feels like to be 10 years old and confused about fractions or worried about fitting in. That's worth more than any professional development workshop. After hanging up, Rebecca sat in her kitchen feeling like she'd just committed to climbing a mountain. Exciting, terrifying, and completely uncertain about whether she was strong enough for the challenge ahead. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of preparation. She spent hours reviewing curriculum standards and reacquainting herself with classroom management strategies. She visited the school to meet her colleagues and see her classroom, a bright space with large windows and bulletin boards waiting to be filled with student work. Her painting time became even more precious during this period of transition. The physical act of mixing colors and making marks on paper grounded her when everything else felt uncertain. She painted more portraits during those weeks. Emma reading on the couch, David working at his laptop, Marcus practicing soccer in the backyard. Not because they'd asked her to, but because she was suddenly aware of how much she wanted to capture these moments before everything changed. One evening, while she was painting in her basement studio, Emma wandered down and perched on a stool to watch her work. "Mom," Emma said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "are you nervous about going back to teaching?" Rebecca considered the question while she mixed a particular shade of green for the background of her painting. "Yes," she said finally. "Very nervous. But you're doing it anyway?" "I'm doing it anyway." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's brave. Or foolish," Rebecca said, laughing. "Maybe both, but probably more brave." The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, Rebecca's last day before starting her new job, she found herself painting with unusual intensity. She'd chosen to work on a self-portrait, not from vanity, but because she wanted to document this moment of transition, to capture the person she was becoming rather than the person she'd been. It was harder than she'd expected, trying to see herself honestly. In the small mirror she'd propped on her easel, she saw a 34-year-old woman with paint-stained fingers and eyes that looked both nervous and determined. There were lines around those eyes that hadn't been there 8 years ago, and silver threads in her hair that caught the light. But there was also something she'd almost forgotten. A sense of possibility, of forward motion, of life being lived rather than simply endured. "How do I look?" she asked the mirror, only half joking. "Like someone ready to try," she answered herself, like someone willing to be imperfect in pursuit of something meaningful. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table for what Rebecca privately thought of as their last normal weeknight dinner. Starting Monday, their routines would shift, their timing would change, their assumptions about who would be where and when would all need adjustment. "I have an announcement," David said, setting down his fork with unusual formality. I know Mom starting her new job is going to mean some changes for all of us. More responsibility for everyone, different schedules, probably some chaos while we figure things out. Rebecca felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Was he having second thoughts? Had the reality of the logistics finally hit him? So I wanted to let you guys know that I talked to my boss about adjusting my travel schedule. For the rest of the school year, I'm going to try to limit business trips to no more than one per month, and never during weeks when Mom has parent conferences or other big school events. Rebecca stared at her husband, surprised by this consideration she hadn't asked for, but deeply needed. "David, you didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," he said firmly. "This is important to you, which makes it important to our family. We're going to make it work, but that means everyone needs to step up, including me." Marcus raised his hand like he was in school. "I can pack my own lunch sometimes, and I know how to make peanut butter sandwiches." "I can help Marcus with his homework," Emma added, "and I'm already doing my own laundry mostly." Looking around the table at her family, her husband offering practical support, her children volunteering to take on more responsibility, Rebecca felt a rush of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. This means more than you know." "We're proud of you, Mom," Emma said matter-of-factly. "It's cool that you're going to be a teacher again." "Yeah," Marcus agreed. "And maybe now when kids ask what my mom does, I can say something more interesting than stays home." Everyone laughed, but Rebecca heard the deeper truth in her son's words. Her children were proud of her for pursuing something that mattered to her. They wanted her to be someone who did things, not just someone who enabled other people's doing. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and David was reviewing quarterly reports, Rebecca made one final trip to her basement studio. Tomorrow would bring the chaos of Thanksgiving preparations, then the weekend of final lesson planning, and then the terrifying, exhilarating return to the classroom. She stood before her easel, looking at the self-portrait she'd been working on. It wasn't finished, might never be finished in any traditional sense, but it captured something true about this moment in her life. A woman caught between who she'd been and who she was becoming, comfortable with the uncertainty because it meant she was moving forward rather than standing still. She picked up her brush and added one final touch, a small highlight in her painted eyes that suggested not just reflection of light, but the presence of someone who was truly seeing herself, her possibilities, her world, with fresh clarity. Rebecca Martinez, wife and mother and teacher and artist, set down her brush and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new opportunities to succeed or fail, or simply try again. But tonight, in this quiet space she'd created for herself, she was exactly who she needed to be. A woman who'd remembered that taking care of herself wasn't a betrayal of her family, it was a gift to them. The painting looked back at her from the easel, imperfect but honest, and Rebecca saw in those brushstrokes something she'd almost lost. The courage to be fully, authentically, unapologetically herself. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering her suburban neighborhood in pristine white. But in her basement studio, surrounded by the evidence of her creative awakening and the promise of professional renewal, Rebecca felt the warmth of a life being reclaimed, one brave choice at a time. The loneliness that had driven her to seek change hadn't disappeared entirely. She suspected it never would completely, that some part of her would always crave more depth, more meaning, more authentic connection with herself and others. But it had transformed from something that isolated her into something that motivated her, an internal compass pointing toward growth and possibility. As she turned off the light and headed upstairs, Rebecca carried with her the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd faced an uncomfortable truth and chosen courage over comfort. The woman who climbed those basement stairs was not the same woman who descended them 3 months ago seeking something she couldn't name. She was someone who painted in the mornings because it fed her soul. Someone who was brave enough to return to work that challenged and fulfilled her. Someone who understood that loving her family completely included loving herself enough to remain whole within that love. Rebecca Martinez was finally, fully, coming home to herself. The end. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if my story touched your heart today, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next confession. Give this video a like if it resonated with you, and share it with another woman who needs to know she's not alone. Together, our voices are stronger.